So, Amber, I want to begin by following up on this recent Abacus opinion poll showing this startling 14% drop in the number of Canadians who are concerned about climate change and its impact on their future. Now, do you see this as a temporary blip, or the fact that cost of living issues are eclipsing climate issues? What's going on here?
Yeah. So I think the that particular poll kind of put a fine point on it. Some of the work that we do at Re.Climate is we do an annual roll-up of public opinion. So we've done that 3 years in a row, and we flagged that earlier this year. So when we looked across 90 plus different surveys and polls, we flagged at that time that there was a decrease in concern or a kind of a decline in concern about climate change. And yeah, I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. Essentially, climate change is competing with a number of different issues. So affordability, cost of housing, cost of living, et cetera, for most people. So whereas in 2015 or around that time, it was kind of one of the top issues for people. Now it sits, third at best, fourth, fifth in the list of priorities for people. So I think that that's important. The other thing I would say is it's also worth thinking about kind of what's underneath of those numbers. So that same poll broke it down by voter intention. So while concern about climate change may be declining, it's not declining for everybody and it's not declining for everyone at the same rate. So if you look at Liberal Party voters or NDP party voters, they sit somewhere at 75%, whereas Conservative Party voters sit, below 50% in terms of their level of concern. And then, a quarter of those would say it's not a priority at all. If you look at some of the other recent work that we've done around a segmentation of Canadians, you have kind of people who are most concerned about climate change. And then you do have a group of people who may be more conservative, who are also concerned about climate change. And then you have a whole group of people who are disengaged. There are just much more pressing issues for them in their daily lives. So I guess what I would say is that if you just look at the number, like one number, what you'll see is a drop. But I think it's important that underneath of that, that doesn't play out the same for everyone, right? So you have some segments of the population where, for women, example, concern is actually still going up. And then depending on where you sit in terms of your political values, that will influence your level of concern about climate change. The other piece has to do with risk and risk theory. So our sense of risk and our concern about that risk has more to do with our ability to do something about it than it does with the size of the risk itself. So the more people feel that climate change is something that they have no control over, that there's nothing that they can do in their daily lives, that they have no choices, related to it, the more that people will kind of become less concerned about it because they can't do anything about it. I think there's other kind of dynamics happening as well. We have decreasing, a general trend of decreasing trust in government. So, a lot of people think that it's government's responsibility to do something about climate change. If they don't trust the government to do it, well, then, they can't worry about it per se. And so that may be influencing level of concern. And also, we're living in a time where we are being fed all of these relatively traumatic images, Jasper burning down, global flooding, extreme heat and et cetera. And sometimes people can't bear the discomfort of the troubling emotions that comes with that.
Well, there are a number of things I want to probe, but you did mention Jasper, and I saw an interesting piece of research from Innovate, a research company out of Toronto, where they surveyed Albertans about the Jasper fire this year and compared it with Albertan responses to the 2016 fire in Fort McMurray. And in comparing concerns about those wildfires linked to climate change, it suggested that there had been an appreciable increase in concern by Albertans from the 2016 fire to this year's fire in Jasper. What do you read into that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that every year between those two fires has been another season in which people who live in Alberta have been experiencing smoke, where their, lives have been impacted. I mean, most dramatic would be, an iconic place in the Canadian imagination, Jasper. Everyone in Alberta has been to Jasper. It's a beautiful place. But the summer before that, et cetera, we've each, I would say, had a moment where we've canceled a camping trip, where our children's summer camp might have been canceled, where we have to close all of our windows because there's so much wildfire smoke. So, I mean, there's the innovative research poll. We've done polling. I think a number of polls would say that Albertans, for the most part, believe that climate change is driving wildfires in the province. So, yeah, and we're all living with it and experiencing it.
And you talk a lot about deploying the connection between extreme weather events and climate change in communicating messages. How important is that for either environmental organizations or just individuals to deploy and use extreme weather events in that respect?
Yeah. Well, not our research, but some, I think, interesting research out of the States shows that just by linking extreme weather to climate change increases support for climate action. Many of the ways that we've been talking about climate change are quite abstract for most people. Emissions, net zero, GHGs, et cetera. And when we can make it tangible, this is what it looks like in real life, people can trust their own experience. They don't have to necessarily rely on, other people or scientists or experts, et cetera. Anyone who lives here can say that we're living with more wildfire smoke each year, and that's quite different than it was, 10 years ago or more. So I think that we know that that's true. So people are making sense of climate change because of extreme weather. And what I would add is that there's one piece that I think is important to add into that kind of message triangle. And that's the role of fossil fuels in driving climate change. So we often are talking about solutions that don't necessarily make sense because we haven't included in the story that climate change is being caused by burning oil, gas, and coal, and climate change is driving extreme weather, right? So burning oil, gas, and coal causes climate change, which is driving extreme weather. And that then allows us to make better sense, or allows people to make better sense of, now that's why we're talking to you about burning less fossil fuels, or the need to be moving to other types of energy sources, so that we can stop the problem that's causing these the extreme weather and natural disasters, et cetera.
So you're saying that making it more real in terms of the cost to humans, whether it's economic, whether it's health, those personal stories really ring home for people.
Yeah, we're humans, and humans make sense of information through stories. And ideally, those stories have something that we can care about within them. I mean, ultimately, all of this is about how do we um, meet people where they're at so that what we're talking to them about is something that they care about.
I wanted to talk about language because it seems to me that words matter in terms of motivating climate action and changing behavior. And I remember a few years ago, the Guardian newspaper in the UK had a discussion, and actually was a pledge they made to change some of the expressions that they use. So let's move from climate change to climate emergency or climate crisis, or even the use of the expression global warming has a much more direct implication on the consequences of what's going on. How do you see language evolving and the way we use it?
Yeah, great question. I have a couple of different thoughts. I think that the move to climate emergency had a policy implication as well. Um, Part of what was behind that was to activate a policy response that mobilized resources and attention and plans and whatnot more quickly. What we know from the research is that there's a certain sense of fatigue around emergency and crisis because, we haven't actually responded as though it was an emergency or a crisis. And it is a long unfolding of disasters and whatnot. So I think the kind of disconnect that people see between using crisis and emergency and the actual response over the past few years has only kind of reinforced this kind of sense of like, well, the government's not doing anything about it. But also, I think that it doesn't get us any farther ahead. I think we've arrived at a space in which most people would recognize climate change and have a sense of like what that is about. And I think for some audiences, the language of emergency and crisis is really closely tied with activism and advocacy work. And so there's a sense of I'm not the kind of person who talks like that. I'm not a protester, or I'm not a, activist. So they don't necessarily feel comfortable using that language. So I think what was a good intention around using emergency and crisis, and it is, a few years onwards, I think that the research would say there's a bit of fatigue.
So, in part, I guess you're saying know your audience, but it reminds me of a statement I heard from a conservative politician in the US who said something to the effect that one could get more bipartisan support for environmental issues if the Democrats, in this case, didn't use some of that climate language, but basically saying, let's soften the language. And, but to what extent do you have to be real about these things?
I personally would say talking about and sharing the stories of people who are impacted by climate change by using more powerful language about what causes climate change and being more plain language, burning fossil fuels like oil, gas, coal will get us farther ahead. The more we can talk about real people that are having real experiences, increasing insurance rate, having to evacuate with their daughter and dog, experiencing flooding. The more that we can tell stories of how people are being impacted right now, and the more we can use plain language on what is causing climate change, that's the real work, I think. And I would agree, like, or rather, I guess what I'm saying is let's not soften that part.
Right. You referenced advocacy and activism, and it reminds me that a few months ago there was the youth-driven climate strike in Vancouver. They've held that for each year, a few years running. And as I recall, the turnout for this year was far lower than it has been in previous years. Do you think that protests in that way, a way of communicating messages, are running out of steam?
Hmm. Also a great question. Um, I think, well, I have a few thoughts. I mean, I think that there are a number of competing priorities at the moment. Um, I think that the war in Gaza, as a youth issue, has become really important.
Right.
I think that cost of living and housing has become really important. I think the disenfranchisement of youth with the lack of government action, has it been increasing. But the role of public protest, I think, is still important. I think that for those people who find a sense of community and purpose in rallying and protesting, it's super important that they continue to do that. And it's also important for the public to see that there is concern. There's concern, and that people are concerned. What I would say is that we can't just have protest and rallies as the only course of action for people. There are a whole bunch of Canadians who are really concerned about climate change, who want to be involved, but they're not the kind of people who are going to take to the streets and to protest. And so they need ways to be engaged in, whether it's community conversations or whether it's participating in changes to their houses, or there are people who want to be involved, in which protest and rallies, etc., signing petitions, that's not their identity. That's not the kind of person that they are, but they're very concerned and they're very willing to be engaged.
Well, thanks so much, Amber, for your insight, your advice, the message that you brought today. Much appreciated.
Yeah, I appreciate it too. And thank you for having me.